We continue our discussion of the US-Iran war that is happening right now. So as you know, I made the prediction that the United States will lose this war. In the last class, we did an overview of the military and strategic position, and today we are going to provide some theoretical framework for how to understand how this war will progress and why ultimately I believe the United States will lose this war. Today I present to you a very important idea in game theory, and once you understand this idea, you understand why things will turn out the way they do. It is called the law of asymmetry. The law of asymmetry. And all this is saying is that the United States and Iran are not peers. They are not equals. The United States is far stronger than Iran, and we should expect the United States to overwhelm and destroy Iran very easily. The law of asymmetry states that this is usually not the case. Usually, the underdog has the advantage. And we see this throughout history all the time. So when the Persians, around 490 BC, invaded mainland Greece against Athens and Sparta, Persia at that time was the first world empire. Infinite resources, infinite manpower, infinite wealth. Yet it lost to the Greeks not once, but twice. Then the Macedonians, under the Greeks, who were basically a tribal army and not even very large, were able to invade Persia, which at that time controlled most of Eurasia, and conquer it in about 10 years. The Romans started off as a tribal people and later built the Mediterranean Empire. Then you have the Aztecs, the Vikings. So this pattern happens repeatedly in human history. A people from the borderlands, a tribe, or a small ethnic group are often able to conquer a massive empire, and the law of asymmetry explains why. So I am going to explain very slowly and in detail how this law of asymmetry works. Let us look at an empire. There are three major advantages to an empire. The first is mass. This simply means they have a huge population. They also have a large pool of manpower. The United States has a population of about 350 million people. But remember, the United States can also draw upon the populations of its allies, including the Five Eyes Alliance, the Anglosphere, Europe, East Asia, South Korea, Japan, basically wherever the Americans have military bases. Most of the world is either allied with the United States or functions as a vassal of the United States, so America can draw upon billions of people for its wars. That is mass. Second is organization. Organization means a hierarchy of bureaucracy and elites that allows you to organize resources and people in order to generate wealth, scientific advancement, and technology. Science and technology then create the most advanced weaponry. Think about how the United States fights wars. It uses satellites for precision targeting. It has aircraft like B-2 bombers and F-15s, some of the most advanced weapons ever created in human history. So that is organization. The final great strength of an empire is the idea of death. Death means that because your population is enormous, because your organization is strong, and because your resources are vast, you can afford to lose many wars. It is not a major issue. If the United States loses this war in Iran, it can simply return later with even more soldiers and even more weapons because its wealth appears infinite. So these are the three major advantages of an empire. And in theory, because of these advantages, an empire should be invincible and eternal. But we know for a fact that all empires fall. And when they fall very hard. Quite honestly, most empires do not even last that long. Maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years for many empires. That is not a long time. So we need to understand why. Why do empires with such vast resources collapse after only a few decades? What we need to understand is that all these advantages eventually become disadvantages in the long term. Let me explain. Mass means a large population, but a huge population also creates inequality. Why? Because there is competition for resources. Too many people competing for too little. This often leads to debt and forms of slavery. As a result, people become complacent, lazy, and indifferent. They compete against one another. They grow to dislike the government. So they lose motivation, not only to work, but especially to fight wars. Mass looks like an advantage at first, but over time it becomes a weakness. Now, organization means elites. The problem is that over time, elites become parasites. Why? Because they profit through rent-seeking. Rent-seeking means using power to extract wealth from the masses instead of producing value. Landlords are a classic example. They do not necessarily work, but they make money because they own land, control resources, and hold capital. This forces the masses into debt and economic dependency, which is something many argue is happening in America today. The problem is that everyone wants to become part of the elite class, and eventually there are too many elites competing for power. Even though elites may have many children, power itself is still limited. It is a hierarchy. This creates what historian Peter Turchin called elite overproduction. Elite overproduction means there are too many elites fighting for too little power. According to Turchin, this leads to turmoil, revolutions, and wars. For example, the French Revolution or the fall of the Roman Republic. This organization and elite competition eventually produce factionalism and internal conflict. That is what we see in America today, where Democrats and Republicans despise each other and refuse to cooperate. It creates political polarization. Another way to describe this is to say the empire becomes insular. It stops caring about the outside world. All attention shifts inward toward Washington, D.C. As a result, the empire begins making foolish mistakes. The last factor is death. The problem with death is that if there are no consequences for failure, people become arrogant, lazy, and incompetent. This leads to hubris. Hubris means blindness caused by arrogance. It creates overconfidence and causes people to repeat the same mistakes over and over again without learning from them. So yes, an empire may appear invincible, but its strengths slowly transform into weaknesses that eventually lead to collapse. Mass leads to inequality. Organization leads to elite overproduction and factionalism. Death leads to hubris. That is why empires eventually fall. But an empire does not collapse by itself. It requires an enemy to force the collapse. What happens is that an enemy emerges which is able to exploit the weaknesses of the empire. And what are those weaknesses? The first weakness is that the people of the empire are not very motivated, so if another society becomes highly motivated, it gains a huge advantage. This is energy. Second, empires become insular. They refuse to admit mistakes or learn from others. But if a society is willing to admit mistakes, willing to learn, willing to promote talent and merit, then it gains another major advantage. This is openness. The final factor is cohesion. Empires become fractured internally, but if a society remains united around a shared purpose, it becomes strong. So if an enemy emerges that possesses energy, openness, and cohesion, that enemy can defeat the empire. As you follow the news about this war between the United States and Iran, ask yourself one question. Will Iran become an energetic, open, and cohesive society? Because if it does, then it could become extremely powerful. The empire will not change because hubris makes it too stagnant and bureaucratic. The empire refuses to admit mistakes. Iran, however, still faces its own problems of mass, organization, and death because it is still a country of 92 million people. But if it can transform itself into a more energetic, open, and cohesive society, then it could triumph over America. That is the fundamental question in this war. Do not focus only on America's technology or economy. Ask yourself, is Iran transforming as a society? Are people becoming more motivated? Are Iranians learning from mistakes, innovating, and becoming resilient? Are Iranians remaining united? If the answer to all three questions is yes, then according to this theory, Iran would win and America would lose. Now let us talk specifically about America and Iran. America has three major advantages in this war: technology, propaganda, and money. Technology includes satellites, precision targeting, advanced aircraft, and the most sophisticated weapon systems in the world. Propaganda means control of the information space. America controls much of the internet, global media outlets like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times, as well as platforms like YouTube and Google. It can shape narratives and public perception. The final advantage is money. The United States controls the dollar, the world's reserve currency. It can print enormous amounts of money to fund wars. This money can be used to hire mercenaries, support proxy groups, or bribe officials and opposition movements. At first glance, this makes America appear unbeatable. But again, according to the law of asymmetry, these strengths can become weaknesses. Technology can create dependency and arrogance. Too much reliance on advanced systems can reduce adaptability and innovation. Propaganda suppresses open debate. If dissenting opinions are silenced, bad decisions go unchallenged, leading to groupthink and poor strategy. Money creates unreliable allies. Groups motivated purely by financial incentives may betray you or exploit you for profit. So America faces three major problems: a lack of political will, weak manufacturing and logistical capacity for a long war, and an inability to tolerate heavy casualties. Many Americans do not want this war. For Iran, however, the conflict is existential. If Iran loses, it risks losing its sovereignty, identity, and civilization. America, on the other hand, could theoretically walk away. America is also better at short wars than prolonged wars. Although it has advanced weapons, manufacturing capacity has weakened after decades of outsourcing industry overseas. And finally, America cannot politically tolerate large numbers of battlefield deaths. Heavy casualties could trigger massive protests and unrest, similar to the Vietnam era. Now let us discuss Iran. Iran also has major disadvantages, but it possesses three important strengths. The first is faith. Iran's Shia identity emphasizes martyrdom, sacrifice, and resistance. This can create strong motivation and willingness to endure suffering. The second is terrain. Iran is mountainous and geographically massive, making invasion extremely difficult. The third is nationalism. Persian civilization stretches back thousands of years. Many Iranians see themselves as defending not only a country, but an ancient civilization and cultural identity. But again, every strength can also become a weakness. Faith can become zealotry and strategic blindness. Terrain can become isolation and economic hardship. Nationalism can be complicated by ethnic divisions inside Iran, since Iran is ethnically diverse and Persians make up only about half the population. According to this theory, America's strategy would be to inflict casualties, damage infrastructure, and encourage ethnic tensions within Iran. But the law of asymmetry suggests that weaker societies often become more adaptive, self-reflective, and resilient because survival forces them to change.